You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is Monday the 18th. It's Ohio State week for Indiana. One of the biggest games in the history of the sport for Indiana. Coming up on Saturday, a top 5 matchup in the Horseshoe, as Indiana attempts to silence the haters and put themselves in a position where a college football playoff berth is an ironclad lock. I would say it should be close to that already if people are thinking straight. But we know how college football is. We can't assume anything. So anyway, we decided, and by we, I mean me, is going to go ahead and jump on, do a live show for about 30, 45 minutes. Wanted to tackle some questions that people had out there and get things kicked off on the right foot. As we got a lot to do this week. We got guests coming up later on this week. We got preview podcasts. We got a whole shebang going on, and excited to talk to you all today. And we're going to try to keep the content flowing throughout the course of the week if we can. So I've got some questions that are queued up, but if you've got some questions, you want to head over to the YouTube channel, Back Home Network YouTube channel. Go ahead and throw them into the comments there. I can pull those up. I can address those directly. And obviously, I've got some earlier ones. And if you're listening after the fact, at least you're getting the benefit of hearing the podcast. So, it's all is not lost. But if you're curious, if you got questions or comments, you can always send them to the Twitter account. We'll be able to tackle them next time. Anyway, before we jump into this real quick, just a reminder, we're part of the Back Home Network here at CrimsonCast, and we are brought to you by Homefield Apparel, our presenting sponsor, and a friend of college football everywhere, the good brand and college football. They go together. I mean, what are you going to say? What are you going to do? I'm wearing Homefield right now. We got the Oval crew neck sweatshirt on at this point. Gritty in the comments asking, how many Homefield products does Galen own? Galen owns a lot of Homefield products. Galen buys Homefield products for other people. I would say, I think conservatively, I'm probably in the 80, 85 range if I'm counting everything like t-shirts, hoodies, crew necks, pullovers, jackets. The t-shirts, I think, make up the bulk of that, but it's all kinds of t-shirts, regular t-shirts, 3/4 length t-shirts. It's a lot of Homefield. You can be a connoisseur of Homefield as well. If you go to homefieldapparel.com, follow them on social media, use the code HOME23 and get 15% off your first order. Again, HOME23. Let's get Homefield all over the country. I see them already every home game, every away game. There's people wearing Homefield, not just IU, but other schools as well. Again, homefieldapparel.com, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. Also, quick reminder, folks, we're on Substack. Go to crimsoncast.substack.com, subscribe, get podcasts delivered right to your inbox. And we appreciate everybody being part of the community. Over 1,000 people in the CrimsonCast Substack community now. All right, we don't have forever, so let's go ahead and jump in to some of the various things that people have got. We had Damon Bruce, our good buddy Damon. Not even Cam Cameron could ruin that logo, which he did. It's kind of a duality there. I always say people, it was called the evil oval for a long time. I got it over my shoulder. Where did it go? There it is. I can't. There we go. That, believe it or not, that is actually from the set of the old Cam Cameron show. That was gifted to me about 6 or 7 years ago by a good friend of the program. So we got some history here in CrimsonCast Studio B. Lots of oval all over the place. And I always tell people, we won 2 national championships with the oval. It just happened to be in soccer, which still matters, obviously. Let's dive in and talk about some of the items that people have been asking about. It's been a busy day on Twitter. It's been a busy day in terms of the discourse, I guess you could call it, or the engagement farming, the trolling that's going on. We got Ryan Russillo deciding to wade into the fray and, poo-poo Indiana's schedule, whatever. I don't know. I want to kind of pump the brakes on everybody a little bit. There's a lot of stuff going back and forth, and it's fun, and I just think it's important to remember a couple of things. SEC fans on Twitter are not going to argue with you in good faith. And I'd also like to note that at this point, they are wish casting. Now, if the committee comes out with their rankings this next day on Tuesday and switches everything around and drops Indiana to like 11th or 12th in the rankings for no reason, having not played, then I think we got beef. But until then, what's hilarious to me is that most of the SEC discourse, and for those who haven't been following along on Twitter, you're lucky, I would argue. What we got is a lot of SEC fans being like, yeah, Indiana's schedule sucks and they haven't played any real teams, and they'd go like 4-6 against an SEC schedule and stuff like that. It's the same stuff that we've heard before. It's just been real loud, and it's been interesting because the national media started to pick up on it. And this is the one spot where I do get a little concerned. I'm not worried about what randos on Twitter say, but I do worry about the framing that's starting to penetrate some of the national media that cover this. We've heard it obviously from Heather Dinich, the CFP reporter. We've heard it from Ryan Russillo. We've heard it from Paul Feinbaum, which you would expect. But the one thing that does concern me a little bit, and we've seen it play out this way with other schools in college football, is you repeat a narrative enough times and it starts to become the perceived reality. And the committee people they're still human beings. They are susceptible to those things. And I'm not saying that SEC people need to shut up. They can say whatever they want. I do think that jumping back into the fray and arguing a counterpoint, because there's several very good counterpoints with all of this schedule stuff with Indiana, is actually a logical thing, and more people should get involved in it. I'll be honest, and I've said this on Twitter a couple of times, I'm wondering where Tony Petitti is right now, the Big Ten commissioner. Because we got Greg Sankey out there doing what Greg Sankey normally does and what he should be doing, which is pumping up his own conference. Big Ten's got to get on this. The Big Ten has a vested interest in getting at least as many playoff teams as the SEC does. And one of my arguments has been, I don't think that the committee is going to willingly put like 5 or 6 SEC teams in at the expense of there only being like 3 Big Ten teams in. But I do start to worry about the narrative being spun and repeated without any counter. And I'm not seeing any counters right now from people that matter. So this is where the Big Ten commissioner really needs to kind of wade into the fray and start defending his team, just like I would have suggested that he would defend Penn State in a similar circumstance. Like there's so many things about the SEC argument that are wrong. Primarily among them is that all of these teams that have one good win or maybe even 2 good wins, that should somehow wipe out the losses that they've got. Ole Miss losing at home to Kentucky, Tennessee losing on the road at Arkansas. There's a bunch of different results that we've seen that they don't just pierce the bubble of the teams that are competing for the college football playoff spots, but they kind of pierce the bubble of this idea that the SEC is this all-dominant conference that everybody is just significantly worse than. And so I'd like to see more coming from Big Ten-related sources pushing back on that. I get the feeling I'm going to be waiting for a while. This is something the Big Ten has not done well historically. So, obviously that just leaves Indiana needing to go in and win the game, or at least play very close. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward in this conversation. But as Randy points out in the comments, Indiana has broken college football discourse. It's hilarious. And it really is funny to me. It is funny that Indiana, of all teams, has created this vortex. I mean, and it's only mid-November. I mean, there's normally some sniping about what's going on in the playoff, but this has gotten to a ridiculous level. And so I do think that it's interesting kind of watching all of this playing out. And obviously what really matters is what the committee is saying and doing. And I still believe that what we're looking at is a scenario where Indiana, even if they lose the Ohio State game, is going to be fine. There's an interesting thing, and this was brought to my attention by our friend Andy Witry, who I think some of you are familiar with. Andy wrote for On3. He wrote for IU Sports Media for many years when he was a student. But he went through and looked at in the college football playoff ranking era. So, basically from 2014 onward, if you look at all of the Power 5 or Power 4 conference teams during that time period, where did the 11-1 teams land in the midst of things? And what's interesting is that, in a 4-team playoff, you had multiple 11-1 teams not make the 4-team playoff. But if you go through and look at the totality of the Power 5 teams that finished 11-1, here's who they were and where they finished. Ohio State in 2016 finished 3rd in the poll, so they made it, or in the standings. In 2015, you had Ohio State finished 7th that year, so they didn't make the 4 team. But Oklahoma at 11-1 was 4. Alabama at 11-1 in 2017 was 4th. Ohio State in 2022 was 4th. Baylor in 2014 was 5th. Notre Dame in 2021 was 5th. TCU, as I mentioned, in 2014 was 6th. And then Ohio State in 2015 and 2023 at 11-1 was 7th. So, you can look at those, and I think you can see there's a precedent here where the committee, for whatever criticisms they've had, they do respect 11-1 teams that are, in power conferences. This isn't something they just sweep under the rug. They're not, we haven't seen situations where I'm sorry, strength of schedule wasn't good enough. It's always been the number of wins versus the number of losses. And Indiana's put themselves in a really good position with that as they move forward. So that's why I am not nervous. It's why I'm not flipping out. Obviously, I want to see Indiana win this weekend, and I think they've got a really good chance of doing it. But I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not the end-all, be-all if they don't win, because historically, the committee has not said, oh, there's an 11-1 team, we're going to put them 13th or 12th or whatever the number is. That's just not how it's gone over the course of the time that the College Football Playoff Committee's been in existence. So just something to keep in mind. As we dive in here, some interesting question marks. Let me just pick up on this a little bit. Tanner Etheridge asked, I would like to hear about Indiana's schedule and the angle that a 2-loss SEC team is undeniably worth more for the playoff, or more worthy for the playoff. It's an unexplored angle not enough people are talking about. Is a 30-point Big Ten win really worth more than a loss to UK, Arkansas, or Vanderbilt? The answer is yes. I mean, here's the thing. The reality of the situation is that most of these schedules and most of what we're seeing in college football right now are tremendously unbalanced. If you look at, one of the reasons why the SEC is in kind of this weird spot right now is they have a bunch of teams that very easily could end up tied without ever having played each other. Or, you end up with tiebreakers where everybody played each other once and one lost to the other, who lost to the other, who lost to the other. This is the product of having a 16-team league or an 18-team league, and you only play a 12-game schedule, and obviously only 9 conference games in the Big Ten, only 8 conference games for the SEC. And, so I think the argument that, we beat, so-and-so mid-tier SEC team, hence that is better than blowing out an opponent in the Big Ten, that's not really how win probabilities work. It does matter to win games. And if you look at statistically, if you added up all the games that Indiana has won so far this year, all 11, I think they have like a 5% chance of actually winning all of those games. And we see over and over again now, when Ole Miss is at home dropping a game to a Kentucky team that's only 46th in FPI, when we've got SEC teams like Mississippi State that are 69th in FPI that have lost to Toledo, teams like that, to me, a lot of this is kind of like what happens in college basketball, where you'll get, scheduling that happens in just a certain way where everybody's power rankings just keep lifting everybody else in the conference up. It's not that all those teams are good. It's that they scheduled in a way so that the floor of their strength of schedule collectively ends up being much higher. The Missouri Valley did this for many years. The Mountain West has started to do it with a lot of success in basketball. And you can do it in football. And the SEC has been smart enough about their scheduling that this was how they elbowed a bunch of teams out in the 4-team era. They're a little more exposed in the 12-team era because you can't just put 6 SEC teams in. That's just not the way that it worked. Randy brings up a good point. I think the way the committee rated Miami after their loss to Georgia Tech was telling. They only dropped 5 spots or so. That's true. And, right now, even if Miami wasn't the auto bid in the ACC, they would still be in the playoff because, if you look at their overall, the ranking that they had in the CFP rankings, they're 9th. That would still be in. And I look at Indiana and I'm like, well, go down Miami's schedule. They've beaten nobody of note. And they lost a game to a middling Georgia Tech team on the road. Penn State, who's fourth in the CFP, one spot ahead of Indiana, really doesn't have a more impressive win than Indiana. I mean, if you want to argue the USC win on the road, I guess that's a USC team that has not exactly lit the world on fire, and I'll note is not in the top 25 of the CFP rankings, but whatever. Penn State, 8-1, their one loss was to Ohio State, and somehow they're still ranked ahead of Indiana. Now, I would argue that Indiana losing at Ohio State, and I'm not saying that they will, but if they were, why would that impact Indiana negatively if it didn't impact Penn State negatively, if Penn State has nothing else on their resume? That ends up being kind of the argument. And when you go to the SEC schools, you know, the thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these SEC schools, again, they're going to have at least one more loss. One of them won't, you know, and I'm guessing it's probably going to be Alabama. If I had to bet, I'd say Alabama, and, you know, maybe it's Alabama versus Georgia, or maybe it's Alabama versus Texas. I'm not sure exactly how the tiebreakers work. Alabama, of course, has the tiebreaker over Georgia. But, you know, Texas could still lose. Tennessee could still lose, plausibly. Ole Miss could still lose. So Texas A&M could still plausibly lose, although it's kind of an apples-to-apples thing with Texas. So a lot of these arguments will suss themselves out. But I think for Indiana, looking at it, and again, going off of what Randy said, Miami only dropping 4 or 5 spots after losing that Georgia Tech game, I think bodes well for Indiana. And if you'll note, like the CFP rankings last week, if you just go down all you do is look at losses and wins. It went 10-0, 8-1, 8-1, 8-1, 10-0, 9-0, 8-1, 8-1, 9-1. You have to get down to 10th to Alabama at 7-2. And then it goes 7-2 for them, 8-2 for Ole Miss, 7-2 for Georgia. And then you've got kind of the lesser teams on the outside looking in, like Boise State and SMU. Maybe that's the paradigm. Maybe it's the idea that, well, you know, we're willing to drop a one-loss team down some, but we also look at other metrics like strength of record. So that's going to be an interesting thing to keep an eye on with the rankings tomorrow to see what all comes out. But that would be how I would answer some of that questioning that Tanner had at the beginning of the question. As we look through some of these other questions and comments, Trent noting 11-1 IU still has a better resume than everyone in the SEC besides maybe a 10-2 Georgia. I mean, look, ultimately it comes down to, like, how are you going to judge it? Are you judging it by strength of schedule, strength of record? Who have you beaten? What type of teams have you beaten? Indiana, you know, they have 7 wins against Power 4 conference opponents. Not a lot of teams in the SEC can say that. Look it up. So that's ultimately what I would say we need to keep in mind. And, you know, and as Tony points out here, I keep seeing the question, who have they beat? My question in return is equally as important. Who have they lost to? They never have a good answer. Losses matter as well. That's what I think is worth noting. Like, losses should matter. Losses have always mattered when it comes to this stuff. But again, don't expect SEC fans or SEC media to argue this stuff in any way other than disingenuously. That's essentially the take-home point with all of these things. A lot of questions. Not all of them had to do with football, but I'm going to kind of stick with some of these items football-wise. So John asks, what in the stats is causing a 12-point spread? I think it might be actually 11.5 points, but what is causing a 12-point spread in terms of this Indiana-Ohio State matchup? It's a good question because, you know, the teams are actually more equal than you might think in certain areas. And that is, you know, something that a lot of people don't necessarily buy when you tell them that. But when I look at the advanced stats, and I would advise everybody to tune in I think we're going to do it Thursday, I hope. We're going to have Taylor Lehman back on. We're going to do a bona fide preview podcast where we take all this into account. But the big things that are contributing to, I guess it is 31-19 that was mentioned, a 12-point margin in S&P Plus, are essentially as follows. Ohio State is 3rd in FPI. Indiana's 11th. Ohio State's 1st in S&P Plus. Indiana's 11th. If you look at offensive and defensive stats in all of those, I mean, Ohio State's just better than Indiana across the board statistically in all of these items. So, like in FEI, which is another power metric, which is an opponent-adjusted data that represents scoring advantage per possession. Ohio State's 1st overall in FEI, 2nd in offense, 3rd in defense. Indiana's 9th in FEI, third in offense, only 30th in defense, although that has gotten better. Both of these teams are pretty evenly matched. Indiana is just like a shade worse in certain areas. Indiana is better in offensive pass success than Ohio State is in defending the pass. But the same applies the other direction. Ohio State's better passing success than Indiana is at stopping it. Both teams are really good in, Indiana's defense is great at stopping line yards per rush. Ohio State's great at forcing them. And both Indiana's offense and Ohio State's defense aren't particularly great in that category. So when you break all of this down, Indiana's statistical profile measures up really well against most teams. Ohio State's just kind of the exemplar that you point to and say, wow, that team is really good everywhere. And that's where I would caution people a little bit about their expectations. Indiana is overmatched physically, and I don't think that I'm not being critical of Indiana, just Ohio State's got a lot of 5 stars, a lot of 4 stars. Indiana has neither of those things. So just in raw physical power, much like we saw against Michigan, Indiana's got a bit of a disadvantage, and Ohio State on the whole has been able to execute better, in both offensively and defensively. And I think really what it's going to come down to some degree is, S&P Plus has Ohio State's defense as the top defense in the country. And Indiana's offense, while good, is only 15th in the country. So can Indiana have a better offensive game than what Ohio State is able to do defensively? And you go down the list and you just look at what Ohio State's done defensively. The only team they've allowed more than 17 points to all season has been Oregon. They let 32 points up there. But, their numbers are impressive. 6 points, 0 points, 14 points, 7 points, 7 points, 32, 17, 13. 17 was Nebraska. 13 was Penn State. Purdue was a shutout, and Northwestern, they allowed 7 points. So to me, that's one of the keys. Like, how well can Indiana find ways to exploit whatever weaknesses they can find in this Ohio State defense? Can they move the ball? If they can't, and we saw them struggle to move the ball in the second half against Michigan, that's a real problem. But that's where Indiana's defense really has to step up and keep Indiana's offense in the game, again, like we saw against Michigan. And that's where I do think some of the notes about Ohio State's offense are important. Like Sam notes, the offensive line for Ohio State is not that amazing. That's true. They've had injuries. They've lost 2 left tackles so far this season. Like, it's been a struggle for them. And ultimately, and I was talking with Taylor about this earlier today, if you can limit what Ohio State does in the running game, which Nebraska did quite well, and actually Penn State did it pretty well also, you do take a lot off the table for them. If you look at what Ohio State has done in terms of running the ball, they're averaging 5.25 yards per rush, which is really, really good. They've rushed for 1,838 yards and 22 touchdowns. So if Indiana is going to be competitive in this game, a lot of it will come down to very basics, but basics against really, really good competition. You've got to move the ball. You've got to score touchdowns. You've got to be able to move the ball through the air quickly to give your own offensive line a break. And then defensively, you just got to gum up Ohio State. It's interesting that S&P Plus is projecting this as a 31-19 game. I would actually say that it's probably going to be a lower scoring game one way or the other. And, I think whether or not Indiana wins or loses, the chances are that they're going to be able to grind some of Ohio State's attack to a halt. It's just a matter of whether Indiana is going to be able to pick it up on their own end. And there are some advantages for Indiana, which we'll talk about more with Taylor. But like Randy points out, Ohio State likes to play man on the outside. If only we had a passing game that could exploit one-on-one coverage. I mean, the nice thing is Indiana's got a good stable of receivers. It sounds like Miles Price is going to be back. Omar Cooper is clearly having, the best season of his young career. Elijah Surratt has struggled lately, but is certainly a guy that you can throw the ball to. Keyshawn Williams has been a revelation here recently. He's really become a really heavily targeted slot receiver. And then Zach Horton, most of the time, is able to pull balls in and disrupt. But Indiana, they've lived so much in that RPO approach. And what'll be interesting is, like, how much does Ohio State pressure that versus how much do they try to sit back? It's going to be a fascinating chess match. And that's the kinds of things I want people to keep in mind. That's ultimately where this game is going to lie, and we'll just have to see what happens with it all. But we'll talk more about it throughout the course of the week, obviously. We have a bunch of other questions here that are, I think some of them we're going to answer tomorrow on Bison Chat. So first of all, I want to give you a programming update on that. Bison Chat will be live on the Back Home Network at 6:45 p.m. tomorrow. Myself, Joe Cronin, Emily Fox, going to be recapping what happened during the bye week. We'll have sound from Curt Cignetti's press conference that happened on Monday. We probably won't have sound from player availability on Tuesday. It's a little too quick of a turnaround, but we will then be doing our live watch of the CFP reveal, which happens at 7, and talking through where Indiana lands and what the implications are as we move ahead. So a lot of your CFP questions and things like that we'll try to tackle at that point. Let me add a couple of other ones, though. Daryl Frazier asked, what would FCS playoffs look like for Division I? We're kind of getting there, and I always felt like if you're going to expand to 12, you're going to end up expanding to 16. There's a lot of inequities in this 12-team format, not the least of which is you're staring down the barrel right now of 3 of the Power Conference 4 probably seeded 1, 2, and 3, and then the 4th Power Conference, the Big 12. I mean, there's a chance they don't even make the field. There's no auto bids for the Power Conferences. It's just who's the highest ranked champion of each conference in the committee's eyes. So what I think is going to be interesting to keep an eye on as we move forward with the playoff is, let's say Boise State ends up getting the 4 seed, and you get a Miami team that's probably overrated a bit as the 3 seed. You're going to have really good at-large teams that are waiting there, have to play an extra game, and then will go play on a neutral field against these conference champions. And I'm not entirely convinced that the conference champions are going to be the test that people think that they are. Some of them might be, but some of them will probably not. So it's kind of like in the NFL, where when you have the 4th seed, is oftentimes the divisional champion who went like 9-8, had a really poor season. They're hosting a playoff game against a wild card team that's won 11 or 12 games. That's like, that seems a little unfair. But, we've always placed this premium on, did you win your conference? We used to place a premium on, did you win games? That's the kind of thing that I think is going to have to change. So an FCS playoff, if you went to a 16 or even a 24-team format, I think we're going to get to that pretty quickly because everybody's going to be paranoid about being left out of this thing. I don't think it's going to stay at 12. 16 might be the right number, and I think buys are kind of overrated as it is at this point. Like, just make everybody play the same number a day of games would be fine with me. There was another question from Daryl. Is there a reality where the SEC and the Big Ten break off from the NCAA and do their own thing? Yeah, there's a reality where that exists. Right now, I don't think it's worth it. And this is where this college football playoff committee is going to be interesting, because I think the interesting thing about this is that both these conferences before the season started wanted to demand 4 auto bids for their conferences, which ironic if you're Indiana thinking about that now. It's like, yeah, that'd be nice. Let's have that. But one of the things that they're going to be very interested in is parity. Both conferences view themselves as the superior conference. They might be begrudgingly willing to admit that the other is an equal. They wouldn't be willing to admit that the other was superior. So if you think about it that way, you can think about it from the standpoint of, if the Big Ten gets snubbed and gets 3 teams in and the SEC gets 6, they might be like, or 5. Big Ten's like, okay, that's not right. This is not going to happen again. And they start exploring like, well, do we need the SEC? And never underestimate tribalism and factionalism when it comes to college football, especially. There's a reason why all these conferences keep, realigning and teams keep getting kicked out or bumped up. Everybody's out for themselves, and that applies to the conferences as much as it applies to the teams. So we'll have to see with all of that, but I think it's an interesting thought process as far as what might happen down the line. We had a bunch of questions about Northwestern's new stadium. Luke Bellotta asked, reaction to Northwestern's new stadium, and what would be your dream upgrades to Memorial Stadium in the future? We had another question about from Teddy Big Bucks, a bit random, but I'm curious your thoughts on the new Ryan Field. for Northwestern, and what implications do you think that'll have on college sports stadiums? I mean, the thing is, I don't know if it's going to have that many implications, because most of these college football stadiums are old and have been added on to. There are not a lot of new stadiums, nor is there a lot of a desire to build a brand new football stadium. I mean, basketball arenas are freaking expensive. A football stadium is, I mean, that's the GDP of like a microstate. That's a lot of money. And you're going to get returns for that when you could still upgrade the one that you've currently got. Northwestern's kind of in a unique circumstance. Like Northwestern, I think, private school, they've got a limited footprint. They had a really old stadium. I did not think, I've been to Ryan Field a couple times. It was probably the least impressive stadium in the conference, I would say. Memorial Stadium was that way for the longest time, but Ryan Field was right up there. Ryan Field was really old looking. And I think Northwestern is looking at this and saying, well, gosh, we have a lot of money. We want to create a fan experience that's going to be consistent, sustainable. We want to have a situation where we don't have to go get 60, 70,000 people to come watch our games, because we're not going to draw that many people. And if we do, it's going to be mostly the opposition's fans. We saw that with Indiana, almost taking over that little 12,000 seat stadium that they play in. So for them, it makes a lot of sense to say we're going to build small. I think their stadium is like 35,000 or something like that. We're going to put a bunch of amenities in it and around it. I think that's cool looking. I don't think it's really a great solution for a lot of the schools out there, because it doesn't really track with the financial realities. And Northwestern, again, in a special spot because they are private and they have a completely different financial experience than what your average public school is going to be dealing with. So that would be something I would keep in mind with all of that. Let's see. I wanted to get to a couple of other questions here. So Craig Davis asks, who the hell should I be rooting for and against in the coming weeks when it comes to helping IU's chances of receiving a spot in the college football playoff? So if you look at the best odds right now, and where there are teams that have questionable odds to get into the college football playoff, what you want to be rooting for is teams to lose more games than Indiana, because it gets progressively harder to argue that Indiana should not be in, but this 2-loss or 3-loss team should. So the teams in particular that I would recommend rooting against are as follows. And I'm going to kind of go from the bottom up. We'll start with Ole Miss. You really need to be rooting for Florida to beat Ole Miss. I think that's a key, and I think it's very possible. Ole Miss, they beat Georgia at home. They got to go to the Swamp. Florida's playing much better. That is absolutely, and we saw this with the LSU game, that's absolutely a game that Florida could win. And I think another loss for Ole Miss knocks them completely out of the picture. They're already on shaky ground because A, they lost at home to Kentucky, and B, they can't make the SEC title game. So they don't have a chance to pick up another big win, and a loss would basically leave them on the outside looking in. Like, there's no way, in my opinion, that they would have enough of a resume to get in with 3 losses. So that would be where I would start with your wish casting. With Miami, SMU, Clemson, I don't worry too much about that group. I think that'll play itself out. So I really, any of those teams, I think you don't really need to worry about their games as they move forward. Tennessee is an interesting one. I think you absolutely need to be rooting for Vanderbilt to beat Tennessee in a couple of weeks. And that's, again, that's a game that Tennessee is favored in, but it's a game that Vanderbilt could win. And that's a rivalry game. Vanderbilt would love nothing more than to get their 7th win or 8th win of the season, depending how this game this week goes for them against Texas. Or maybe it's not Texas they're playing this week. But they would love nothing more than to ruin Tennessee's chance at getting into the college football playoff. And the game is in Nashville. So that's one to look at. I think you got to root for both Army and Southern Cal, or USC, as the locals call it, against Notre Dame. Because, again, Notre Dame is a threat to Indiana, where, yes, Notre Dame has a worse loss, but they have a better win. They did win at Texas A&M, and they have blown out teams the same way that Indiana has blown out teams over the course of most of the season. But another loss for the Irish, I don't see the argument to get them in. That would be what I would say. So those are the teams I think you should focus on. Like, I think Georgia's going to get in. I think Texas, unless they stumble at A&M and then have to play in the SEC title game and lose it. I don't see a route where Texas doesn't get in at this point, even though they probably don't deserve it. Penn State, I do think it would be interesting if Penn State lost to Minnesota. That game is coming up this week. I could see that happening. That seems like the kind of game that Penn State loses. But Minnesota is also very mercurial. Like, they went out and they beat USC, and they've beaten a couple of other teams, and then they turn around and they lose to Rutgers. It's like, what is going on? It's a typical PJ Fleck team. But a loss for Penn State in that Minnesota game is going to be really hard for them to come back on. So those would be the games and the teams that I would look at. The one other thing I'll say is you really do want the Big 12 champ to be 12th at best in the poll. And so that's where I think you got to root for Kansas against Colorado. I think you got to root for Arizona State against BYU. I think you just want to get both of those teams kind of knocked down another peg. BYU's already pretty screwed. This would screw them even more. So now you want to hand Colorado a loss. And again, Big 12, great example of a league that does not have everybody play everybody else, and it's showing up in the lack of clear tiebreaker scenarios in that conference. So that would be what I would suggest at this point. But, it's really a week-by-week thing. We are starting to coalesce around this idea, I think, though, that being a one-loss power conference team heading into this last part of the season when most of these teams are going to end up with 2 losses or more is a good place to be if you're Indiana. Pitt Hoosier asks a question that's near and dear to my heart. One of the reasons I love you guys, meaning me and Scott, I guess, is that you have shared you have the shared experience of long-suffering IU fans. Here's my issue right now. How do I hold on to the wonder? I don't want to see an IU Alabama college football playoff projection and not stare in disbelief, but this sometimes happens now. Help me hold on. So this is why I have been telling everybody that I know, enjoy the hell out of this season. Like, do everything you can to soak up every minute of every game, every minute of every tailgate, every minute of every post-game celebration like we had coming up or coming out of the tunnel, after the Michigan game. Soak all that in. And the reason I say that is it's never going to feel quite like this again. That doesn't mean it's not going to be great. And I am so fired up that Curt Cignetti is going to be here, that hopefully his staff sticks around, that he's going to be able to build this program in the proper way. I couldn't have more trust in a guy based upon what he's already demonstrated. But you have to understand, like, you only get to arrive once. Once you've arrived, and then it wears off. Indiana, people forget, like, they made the Rose Bowl in 67. Everybody's excited. That Indiana football team was still pretty good the next couple of years. They were ranked on a couple of occasions. They didn't have as successful seasons, but the afterglow of that lasted a little while. And then it kind of descended back into unfortunateness. Being able to celebrate this Indiana season thoroughly is, I think, the best thing you can do for yourself. Because if you don't, if you're like, I'm gonna hold back, I'm gonna wait to see, when you jump in next year, it's just not going to feel the same. The best analogy, and I can't take credit for this one, this has been pointed out by a couple of people, but think about, for those of you who are IU basketball fans, think about the difference in the feeling between the 2011-2012 team and the 2012-2013 team. 2011-2012 was a team that was underrated. A lot of press didn't even predict them to make the tournament. I remember I predicted that they were going to get an 8 seed, and people were like, "You're crazy. They're too far away." And I'm like, they're actually more talented than this, guys. I think they'll be fine. The watch shot happens, and there were other great moments in that season. The win versus Notre Dame in Indianapolis, the win down in Evansville, the win at North Carolina State, the Ohio State win over break, the Michigan State win over break. And then, there's that little bit of a lull, but that season was such a joyride because Indiana was achieving things they hadn't achieved in a long time. It was a likable group of players. The whole thing was just a good vibe. 2012-2013 was objectively a more talented team. It was a better team. It was a team that was picked number 1. They were on the cover of Sports Illustrated. But there was a tension around that team. They were expected to be good. It wasn't quite as fun. And it doesn't mean that it wasn't a great season to watch, and there were some tremendous moments from that. But I do think it's important to just remember, like, it can just be a season, and suddenly your expectations are different. So when Pitt Hoosier asks about holding on to the wonder, this is where this season's memories, I think, are going to be so powerful. And look, you don't have to become a jaded, self-important, entitled college football fan like so many of the people we're seeing engaging with us on Twitter from the SEC. You can just enjoy being good. That's perfectly allowed. But that wonder that you're getting when Indiana's popping up as the 7 in the 7-10 game versus Alabama, that's the kind of thing that you'll probably grow out of pretty quickly, which is wild to think about. But that's generally how these things go. Couple other quick items for you before we wrap up. We're getting close to the end of things. Hoosier Review asks, storm the field after beating Purdue? No, absolutely not. That's a routine win. That should be viewed as a routine win. I think there's better ways to demonstrate your joy and your support for the team. I'd love it if the fans got to go on the field after the Purdue game. I think that'd be awesome, especially with the players, always coming over and celebrating with the student section. It'd be awesome to go down on the field and kind of experience that with them, but don't tear the goalpost down. I guess you didn't actually say tear the goalpost down, but when I see storm the field, that's what my interpretation of that is. But maybe not storm the field, but it'd be great to let the fans out on the field. They won't do it, but it would be cool to see. Hoosier Review also asks, Galen, do you have go-to IU gear that you plan on wearing into the shoe? Have you and Scott been superstitious this year, or have you been mixing it up? I've been mixing it up. I've worn a bunch of different IU stuff, all home field, of course. I've had the red script IU hoodie. That's been really handy. I've worn the kind of Corso-ish looking sweater that they put out a couple of years ago. I've rotated quite a bit, and I've been happy I've done that. Now, I haven't been like obsessive about not repeating. My whole thing is I want to be comfortable. I want to be warm. I want to be able to exhibit my fandom. So I don't have a very ornate dress code when it comes to going to IU games. I also, have to tailgate before most of them. So I have to wear things that I can move around in the cooking zone in more effectively. So just, normal jeans, t-shirt combo. And then if it's colder, I'll put a sweatshirt on. That all seems to work out pretty well. I haven't decided what I'm going to wear for the shoe yet this week, but we'll see. Anyway, wrapping things up. There we go. Jamie has the right idea. Storm the field when we win in Columbus. I like that. Let's keep that energy. We're going to go ahead and wrap this one up. I appreciate everybody jumping on. We have about 45 minutes here on this podcast. We're going to have a lot more. We've got guests from Ohio State land joining us a couple of different times this week, actually. We'll obviously have Taylor Lehman hopefully on later on this week to talk through things. Might have a couple of other guests. We've got Bison Chat tomorrow at 6:45. Joe Cronin, Emily Fox going to be joining me on that. So just stay tuned throughout the course of the week. We'll have plenty of content as we get you ready for Ohio State versus Indiana. So, folks, keep fighting the good fight on social media. Don't let those people tell you anything other than what you know to the truth to be, which is that Indiana is going to win in Columbus on Saturday and get in the college football playoff. Anyway, for all you folks, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. I'm Galen Clavio for the Back Home Network. We will catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.